All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So if you all remember, um we were doing these ayat وقالوا هذه أنعام وحرث حجر لا يطعمها إلا من نشاء بزعمهم وأنعام حرمت ظهورها. Now we did before these ayat وجعلوا لله مما ذرأ من الحرث والأنعام نصيبا فقالوا هذا لله بزعمهم. We did this portion of it, and I think we also did it in Tafseer al-Qurtubi. Remember when we talked about the different qira'at in regards to that ayah, and we basically quoted this one about the different qira'ah in terms of the ayat in on for this ayah, and there was different qira'at and how they responded to it. So we're just going to directly jump, because of time, we're going to directly jump to this ayah. وقالوا هذه أنعام وحرث حجر لا يطعمها إلا من نشاء بزعمهم وأنعام حرمت ظهورها وأنعام لا يذكرون اسم الله عليها افتراء عليه سيجزيهم بما كانوا يفترون. I'm going to give you a very surface translation first. And they said, the an'am are basically specific to the animals that are herbivore animals that we eat, and herbivore animals that are goat, that are cattle and sheep and camels. So those would be al-an'am. Okay. Waharth, so we're talking about the different vegetation, we're talking about different plants that is basically used as a source of food. Okay, hijrun, hijr means that it is specifically to be used, or that it would be meant for one specific thing. Okay, لا يطعمها إلا من نشاء. The only ones that would feed on it are the ones that who we would choose, and they would make the claim on who actually makes. In other words, they're making their own legislation. They're making their own legislation, making their own series of what it means to be ethical and what doesn't mean to be ethical. And then the word bizamihim was in order to let us know that it was a made-up religion. It was a made-up legislation. It was all something that they had decided on their own, and then they would attribute it that was either ethical, or attributed as a noble thing, or attributed as that this was divine. And وَأَنْعَامٌ حُرِّمَتْ ظُهُورُهَا. So then they would also select certain animals that they would consider that they're not allowed to ride on it for certain religious reasons, and other animals that they would not even mention the name of Allah on it. And of course, they would have their own rituals, which they basically would make up. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala سَيَجْزِيهِمْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ. And the Lord Almighty will hold them accountable for what they would basically create in blasphemy. So let's see right here, because there are a number of different things. So we do recognize that this is speaking about the people during the era of Jahiliyyah. So there's no question about that. We already know that this was from the time of Jahiliyyah, and this was basically speaking about a religious culture that they had, a religious ritual, and a certain culture that they used to practice. Let's just look at least some of the words, and then we're going to put the pieces together. So Aban ibn Uthman, he basically read, so they were, I guess the Ibn al-Qurtubi was really focused on, in the beginning, on the qira'at. I'm not sure why within these segments, I guess he was really focused on qira'at more than anything. We're going to see later on, when he gets to this ayah, how he's going to go into a number of, or is it that ayah? No, it's this ayah. Okay, let me see. Yeah, and later on, there's going to be an ayah there. He's going to be having 23 وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. He's going to be, this ayah right here, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. He's going to have 23 different issues to talk about, just this word right here. So we're really getting there. But within these two ayat, he's really focused on the different qira'at. Why is he focused on the different qira'at? I mean, what's the big issue? So here's the thing. When we're speaking about another qira'ah, some qira'at, they don't really make a difference in meaning because it's just a different lugha. What do we mean by a different lugha? We just mean that it's a variant recitation, it's a variant way of speaking, a variant way of structure, but the meaning is really the same. So that's one way of basically that was approved as a different qira'ah. So just when we talked about that earlier last time, when we talked about zayyana and zuyina, is this a different qira'ah or is this a passive voice? What do we mean by that? Or when we talked about different words, is it yakun, is it takun, and what does it really mean? All of that. So we said that sometimes it's a lugha and sometimes it's not a lugha. Sometimes the lugha itself can have different ways of saying things. So it doesn't necessarily have to have the same exact structure. So let's look at this one. This one in this qira'ah, it's not hijrun, it's hujurun in this qira'ah. Hujurun. In another qira'ah, hajrun. Look at this one. Here it is. The first one is hujurun. The second qira'ah is hajrun. And the third qira'ah is hujurun. Okay, let's see this one. And in all of those, and there's another qira'ah where in all of the words hijrun, except in qira'at Abu Ubaid an Harun, that in all the qira'at he would read it as hujrun, except in this ayah he would read it as hijran. That was the only one. Regardless, I'm not going to get into the details, but at least that we would recognize, so is this necessarily a different meaning? So here he explained that it's not necessarily a different meaning, but in Lugha Arabiya, sometimes you can have words that may have synonyms in certain ways. And he said it's just a different way to say things, but it actually goes back to the same concept, to the same idea, just like the word jabada and jadaba. That jabada and jadaba, that they're basically one word, but different accents say things differently. In other words, you could say using jabada and jadaba, sometimes flipping around the letters, but really giving the same exact meaning. So you could see right there, same thing when some would actually say not hijrun, but hirj or al-haraj. Okay, so they would say hirjun as hirjun, not hijrun, but really the same meaning, as it is coming from the root il-haraj, which basically means something is tight or something is narrow. So at the end, whether you're speaking about tightness, you're speaking about narrowness, you're speaking about tightness, you're talking about narrowness. In other words, you're making something rather specific to something. And in other words, when you're looking at this ayah, وَقَالُوا هَذِهِ أَنْعَمُ وَحَرْثٌ حِجْرٌ or حِرْجٌ or حُجُرٌ or hajrun, all of that is going to come to the same meaning, that they used to make specific rituals, and they were invented rituals where certain animals, certain plants that was basically foods, foods that is produce, they would make it as specific to certain people, specific to certain to a certain way of doing certain structure. At the end is that they narrowed down whether the consumption or whether who uses it or how it's used, at the end of the day, this is that hijr. It's specified. They made their own ritual. They made their own culture in what they considered as basically an acceptable practice and what's not considered an acceptable practice. So, the whole idea that is important for us, regardless what kind of practice that they were practicing, regardless of what they used to practice, the whole idea is to let us see the same pattern that other people might use, which is to consider a specific ritual, a specific culture, a specific legislation, and then they would give it a name, whether calling it a noble act, or whether giving it perhaps that if you don't do it that way, then this is a taboo. If you don't do it in their structure, at the end, that their resource was confused. It was their own invention. The resource was really their own invention. They made all this up, and then they attributed to God, or they attributed to nobility, or attributed that this is the right thing to do, this is ethical, etc. So whether we're speaking about, like I said, whether we're speaking about hujurun or hujurun or hijrun, it all comes from the haraj idea, the haraj concept. So therefore, il-hijr, he said it's basically a word that basically has a number of different meanings that pretty much go within the same area, or within the same concept, to basically say that it was restricted, to a certain group of people. And that's why al-aql itself is called hijran. Basically, it's supposed to be restricting one from doing immoral acts. And same thing when you look at هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر. الحجر is basically the relatives, okay? But we're not going to get into the details of هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر. Let's stay on our topic right there. Okay, so what did they do at the end? He said, well, that would mean that they had prevented or prohibited certain animals and certain plants, and basically made it exclusive to their idols. And then they would only give these foods to certain people that are doing services to the idols. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically wanted to expose that culture is not divine based, but is basically based on those gurus, or those priests or monks or whatever, that they were doing those services to those gods. In other words, the whole thing is invented. And who is it really benefiting? It's only benefiting basically those that are doing services for the gods, and not necessarily getting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would make it seem like it's going to Allah, but the truth of the matter is that it's going to those priests that are inventing all of this and making their own restriction, and it was basically benefiting them alone. Okay, what iftira'an, what is iftira'an right there? So iftira'an, what is that supposed to mean? That it was all a blasphemy. It was all a blasphemy. It was all a made-up lie, and they would create a narrative that it was going to Allah. Why would they create that narrative? They would create that narrative because they basically wanted to make it seem as if it was a divine, religious, noble act. As if it was a divine and a religious, noble act. Now, this is extremely important, that you will see many people in the name of God or in the name of Islam, they want to change the narrative. They want to, make it seem like what they are doing is approved by God. And if you don't agree with their narrative, then they will either attack the religion, or they will attack you as basically lacking the knowledge or whatever it is. And this is very common that you would see within even the Muslim society. If you do not give Islam based on what they would want Islam to say, then that's when they would say, well, either that they don't believe in that in that interpretation, or they will make up a new interpretation. And we had seen that within the Muslim community, even some of those motivational speakers, or even so-called du'at, etc. This is very common. They'll basically create a new interpretation for the religion in order to gain and get basically to get acceptance from the influencers, to gain acceptance from people, or to probably get more followers. And that's what they'll do, is that they'll get more followers by making appealing statements and attribute it to the religion. So by attributing it to the religion, what are you getting? You're basically getting the people to believe that you are coming from a divine interpretation, and it's not shaitani. It's not coming from the shaitan interpretation, but it's a divine interpretation. And of course, making up a new interpretation and attributing it to the religion. And others would want it to be done differently. It's if they don't get the religious interpretation to suit their expectation or to suit their angle and what they want to see, that's when they would either, one, attack the alim, the scholar, or they would basically accuse that there is something wrong with that interpretation or something wrong with the religion, and basically leave the religion. And this is also something that we had seen, that certain people leaving the religion because they didn't find that the legislation to them was making sense, or making what they would consider as the proper way of what would make let's say a sense according to their definition of legislation. And in the women's area, so let's talk about the women's area. In the women's area, we had seen a lot of the feminist influence basically infiltrating the Muslim mind, infiltrating many Muslims. And I had seen, there was a female Muslim group. Okay, this is real, ladies. Okay, a female Muslim group, and I was in it. And unfortunately, many of them were actually influenced by a lot of the feminist rhetoric. Okay. And when I started exposing some of those ideas and exposing that they trace back to a feminist version and not necessarily an Islamic version. So they were Muslim women that were Muslim women, of course, coming in as they were the ones that were experts in Islam, etc. But then what they were doing is that they were making a new interpretation of Islam, literally, a new interpretation of Islam that sounded, let's say, decent, that sounded good, and that sounded like it went in congruence and basically fit the Islamic narrative, when in reality, it was not actually fitting the Islamic narrative. It was not at all tracing back to Quran and Sunnah, but it was coming to suit a feminist narrative, and it was coming in from a feminist influence. You could see it's a feminist influence that wanted to edit the words of Islam to make it seem that it was that it was coming in as either containing equality or containing an unbiased interpretation, etc. But the truth of the matter is that no, your feminist interpretation is not unbiased, but it's actually a biased interpretation. It's, even if it is probably to you coming that, hey, this is making our religion contain equality or contain justice or basically not misogynist according to you. At the end of the day, وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. At the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that legislates. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that determines truth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that assigns what legislation and what fair legislation looks like, what halal is, what social distribution in based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks like, what is fair, because at the end there's a difference between male and female. So to think that we have to be making it in total equality is actually going against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created even in nature. And subhanAllah, you could say many would come in. Of course, they didn't like what I said because I was exposing the feminist biases. I was exposing those interpretations that are not coming from Islam, but are coming from basically a feminist interpretation. And this is extremely dangerous, because if we're going to bring in a feminist interpretation and give it a religious or an Islamic label, then we're doing exactly like the people of Quraysh and what they were doing. They were, if at the end, this is going to be iftira'an ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is going to be creating a lie and attributing it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how do I know if it's a feminist interpretation or whether it's a misogynist influence from the traditional thinking? Is there any misogyny in probably the Muslim scholars of the past? Perhaps, I don't deny that. There was, you can see some scholars, they're not infallible. But how do you know it's not, or it is a misogynist, or whether it is a feminist, or how do you know? A couple things. Number one is that in order to make a sound Islamic interpretation, yes, you got to go back to the Quran. Okay, we don't disagree on that. And the Sunnah, we don't disagree on that. But here's the thing, is that the interpretation must also contain backed up evidence from the interpretation that even the Sahaba had approved or endorsed, either in their practice or in their words. In other words, you are getting an interpretation even from scholars of the Sahaba or later scholars that understood the Lugha Arabiya right, that understood the context, that understood the hadith, that put the pieces together in order for us to make sure that we are having an interpretation, that we are having an understanding that is endorsed by what the Quran is saying and what the Lugha itself and what the language itself is delivering, and not making our own interpretation. So in other words, what do we need? We need a scholarly endorsement, a scholarly approval, in order to say that this really traces back to the meaning that was supported in Lugha Arabiya, that is supported by Sunnah, that is supported by the scholars themselves, the qira'at, etc., to help us make sure that we're not making our own interpretation. Because you can claim that your interpretation is not biased. Anybody can claim so, but you would need scholarly support, not modern scholars, because the modern scholars, you could never guarantee that they had been deviated. We would need that scholar to had one said the interpretation, said that tafseer of it, and two, that scholar basically had died on haqq. Yes, died on haqq. And others endorsed also that interpretation, that it was coming from a scholarly basis, from a scholarly reference. All right. Now, so this is extremely important. So we don't basically just say that, oh, it sounds very interesting. It sounds very attractive. It sounds, at least it's going to be getting a lot of acceptance from the people. No, we base things based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not based on how many people are liking the idea. It's not based on how many people like the idea. Because the second that you would look for how many people are liking the idea, then you're considering the people as your reference. Then you're considering the people as basically the same thing that the Jahiliyyah were doing. What did they consider? Well, they considered those people, whether the ones that are doing services to the idols or whether, and they considered, of course, that these people were doing services, they were approved, they were good people, they were noble people, they were people that were approved by the society as doing something that is not in their own self-interest, but for the interest of the masses. Okay, now here's one thing, is that this basically is letting us know a certain paradigm, a certain practice. This is very common that you would find within the societies. They would consider certain people as the reference. And these certain people, whether they were called religious figures or whether they were called maybe psychiatrist or psychologist or probably maybe an influencer or probably politician or whatever it is. So at the end of the day, Islam is telling you that you have to make sure that you have your resources in place to give you the right narrative, to give you the right explanation. And the right explanation is going to be going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. وَقَالُوا مَا فِي بُطُونِ هَذِهِ الْأَنْعَامِ خَالِصَةٌ لِذُكُورِنَا. So now what did they do? Now they wanted to be a very misogynist. Here we go. They wanted to be very misogynist. Of course, it was a society that was that was, of course, basing everything based on male power. Okay, let's see. So what did they do? So they said, first of all, let's give a surface interpretation. And they said what is in the stomachs of these animals is exclusive to our males and is for prohibited on our women or our pairs. And if it is dead, then they would be sharing it together. For the Lord Almighty is going to hold them accountable for such description. He is all wise and all knowing. Okay, so what happened? What is this talking about? Is this talking about things that are in the stomach? Let's see what al-Qurtubi said. He said it's a different kind and a different kind of their ignorance. And Ibn Abbas had said what they meant by what is in their stomachs, it was really referring to the milk. And they considered some milk is exclusive to boys and men, and other is basically prohibited on women, and that they were not supposed to be drinking from it. And of course, they'll create a narrative to make it that it's not acceptable for women to drink this because they might create a narrative that it was going to result in such and such, probably taboos or whatever it is. All right. Or some scholars said that no, this isn't talking about milk per se, but this is talking about that certain animals that they would consider it as exclusive for girls. And in other words, when the baby is born, then in that situation, it was already assigned that this was only for men to consume. And then if this animal basically bore a dead baby, they would be something that both the men and the women would consume. So if it was alive, it would be for the men to eat, and if it was dead, men and women would share it. Okay, so at the end is that you could say, regardless of whether that was speaking about the milk or whether that was talking about the newborn animals and whether they were going to be consumed for men or women, at the end, such classification was also done by them, and such classification was made up by them as well. Okay, let's see. Okay. Oh, we had to make sure that everything's safe. Okay, let's continue. Where was it? Okay. وقالوا ما في بطون هذه الأنعام خالصة لذكورنا. Yeah, I know. My daughter told me. That's okay. At least you guys know what I'm doing. We'll delete this portion of it. All right. Let's see. I'm gonna skip this portion of it and get to the point. وقيل إن ما ترجع إلى الألبان والأجنة. Okay, so what is that supposed to mean right there? ما في بطون هذه الأنعام. When we're speaking about ما في بطون هذه الأنعام, that all that is in the stomachs of those animals basically is going to be exclusive to the boys, and basically he prohibited on the azwajina. I want you to look at the word azwajina for a bit. Azwajina means wives, okay? Azwajina means wives. But is this necessarily talking about the wives, or is this talking about the girls and all girls? It was really referring to their counterparts, meaning the women, all women. So whether it was daughters, it was wives, in other words, it was prohibited on all the women, and therefore it was really based on a misogynist description. And of course, we already know that the society was extremely misogynist. We already know that piece of it, to the point that they buried women alive. But maybe the question is, well, did some of such views continue within the Muslim era? This is a question that many would say. So number one is that the Prophet ﷺ had said, خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم. The Prophet ﷺ had also said, تَرَكْتُكُمْ عَلَى الْمَحَجَّةِ الْبَيْضَاءِ لَيْلُهَا كَنَهَارِهَا. The Prophet ﷺ said, my era is the best era. Two, he said, I had left you on a matter that is clear. In other words, white. It doesn't have all those jahiliyyah. It was really clear. So is this talking about Islam itself, or is this talking about the culture that the Prophet ﷺ had basically disciplined from the Sahaba? It's talking about both. So in other words, if you really want to get the best interpretation, whether we're speaking about legislation that contains no misogyny or no jahiliyyah, you have to go back to khayrul quruni qarni. You got to go back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ's time. That's the only time that contained no jahiliyyah. But someone might say, well, here the Prophet ﷺ had told Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, when he told that man, told basically Bilal ibn Rabah, the son of a black woman. The Prophet ﷺ gets furious and he says, Jahiliyyah when I'm still around you? Jahiliyyah when I'm still around you? Yes, Jahiliyyah when I'm still around you. So in other words, can there be any Jahiliyyah? The answer is yes, there can be Jahiliyyah. Is misogyny Jahiliyyah? Yes, certainly it is Jahiliyyah. But in order for you to make sure that you're not influenced by a different type of jahiliyyah, whether that was called misogyny or whether that was called feminism. So feminism is a jahiliyyah, and so is misogyny, and so is a combination that we would make on our own and create on our own. So how do I know that it's not jahiliyyah? You would know that it's not jahiliyyah by going back to khayrul quruni qarni, by going back to the prophetic interpretation. That's the only way that you would make sure that it's not jahiliyyah. Otherwise, you're confusing your matters and you are making up a certain jahiliyyah of your own. And then you're considering it as a noble thing. So what does a Muslim do? A Muslim recognizes that as long as I go back to the Islamic interpretation, that's how I could assure that I'm not making up my own delusion in creating a new Jahiliyyah. So this is extremely important. Khairul Quruni Qarni. The Prophet ﷺ had left us basically on the best interpretation, the best deen, and therefore we would go back to the Prophet ﷺ. Khairul Quruni Qarni. Okay, now وَإِيَّكُمْ مَيْتَةً فَهُمْ فِيهِ شُرَكَاء. If it was a dead mate, they would basically consider that, yeah, we're going to be sharing this for men and women. And in another qira'ah, مَيْتَةٌ. So does that make a difference? وَإِيَّكُمْ مَيْتَةً or وَإِيَّكُمْ مَيْتَةٌ? At the end of the day, okay, the idea is really in the same concept. Okay, ميتة or ميتة, it really goes back to the same idea. سيجزيهم وصفهم, for the Lord Almighty would hold them accountable for, the word is وصفهم. What is الوصف? الوصف is a description. So is this a description or a classification? It's both. So when you make a classification, you make a description of something. And this is something that we have to recognize, that by calling a certain act as this is noble, or this is acceptable, this is ethical, this is not ethical, etc., this isn't just, an opinion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. You describing a certain interpretation as misogynist, even though that's what Islam says. سيجزيهم وصفهم. Just like when we had Amina Wadud, she described Prophet Ibrahim عليه السلام as a deadbeat. That's what she described him, literally. And she described that the Quran as a misogynist revelation. سيجزيهم وصفهم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you accountable for describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and describing the Quran as containing injustice, or as containing some form of biasy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one that is al-adl. He is the one that brings justice. He is the one that is al-hakim. He is the one that is al-khabir. So if you believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-hakim, is al-khabir, you would basically go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one to define things for you, and to somehow consider your own description as the reference, as the center that sets and that defines truth. We've got a big problem with this. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them accountable for this description, and that is كَذِبَهُمْ وَافْتِرَاءَهُمْ. That's the lie, that's the blasphemy that they had created, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them accountable for it. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. Same thing when we're talking about making up a fatwa and attributing it that's what Islam says. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hold them accountable for whatever description, whether they wanted to say it was halal, it was haram, etc. And that's the danger of giving a fatwa. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. When you're giving a fatwa, you are basically claiming something to be as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves of and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't approve of. That's a fatwa. Il-fatwa is that you are claiming that based on the references that this is the divine selection, or this is the divine interpretation, or this is the divine interpretation of whether something is just or not. That's a dangerous thing to do. And this is extremely important, to make sure that you go back to the Quran and Sunnah, you go back to Maqasid al-Sharia, you are basically qualified to make sure that you are not making up your religious description, or you're not making up your own wasf, your own description, but you're actually really backed up by the evidences that support such interpretation. Okay, and what is this supposed to be saying? Look at this quote that القرطبي had said. وفي الآية دليل على أن العالم ينبغي له أن يتعلم قول من خالفه وإن لم يأخذ به حتى يعرف فساد قوله ويعلم كيف يرد عليه، لأن الله تعالى أعلم النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وأصحابه قول من خالفهم من أهل زمانهم ليعرفوا فساد قولهم. All right. What is he saying? And in this ayah, there's evidence that a scholar must know all the opposing arguments, even if they were not embracing those arguments, in order to know how to differentiate and how to recognize the discrepancies in their words, and also learn how to respond and refute such words, for the Lord Almighty had given ilm to the prophets and his companions the words and how to respond to those that had opposed them from during their time, in order to recognize what discrepancies and what is wrong, or what faults, or what is basically wrong in their claims or in the words that they were making up. So what is that supposed to let us know? That for a person to be a alim, it's extremely important to make sure that the person is also aware of the modern jahiliyyah, at least during their times, the common jahiliyyah during those times. So during our times, learning about feminism in order to be protected from its influences, that's part of what you have to learn as a Muslim. Learning how to respond to those misconceptions is also part of ilm. Learning how to differentiate between what is Islam and what is a feminist influence, or what is a postmodern influence, or what is a liberal influence, or whether something is perhaps maybe within your area, if it's a Hindu influence, if it's a Jewish influence, if it's a Christian influence, if it's a liberal and Western influence, whatever it is, because everything's going to be, if it's not Islam, it's Jahiliyyah. If it's not Islam, it's Jahiliyyah. It's that simple. So you would have to recognize not only al-haqq, but you also have to learn some of al-batil in order to make sure that you don't become a consumer of it. This is ilm. To learn how to respond to it. 2, how to make sure that you are not consuming it without you realizing. And 3, how you would protect those that are basically consumers of such thoughts, how you'd protect them from all of those. This is important. All right, let's see. قد خسر الذين قتلوا أولادهم سفها بغير علم وحرموا ما رزقهم الله افتراء على الله قد ضلوا وما كانوا مهتدين. So how did we get to the children again? Hold on, let me explain this one. And those that had killed their children were in complete loss. Why did they kill them? سفهم بغير علم. They killed them with no knowledge. And السفه, what is السفه? السفه, the proper English word is pikayun, small-minded, somebody that is narrow in their vision, narrow in their understanding. In other words, they made confusion. They made a confusion in how they would interpret things and how they would assign truth. And that's safaham bighayri ilm, with no knowledge. Do they have any basis? No, that's a safa. So I thought this safiya was also a person that is wandering the money. True, that's another form of safi. Okay, how did we then get a person that wanders the money and a person that does not have the right vision. How did they come in? A person that doesn't have the right understanding and the recognition of how to do money management, or how to do fair distribution, or how to recognize what needs to be done in decision making, that's a safa. A safa is making the wrong decision, is not having the right data understood and the right interpretation made, because they were confusing their resources. So whether that resource is in understanding social distribution, or whether that was in confusing their resources in money, resources in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them in potentials, confusing those resources, or confusing who acts as the reference in understanding right and wrong. If they were confusing their resources, that would actually mean this is safa, whether resources in ilm, identifying truth, or resources in their potentials, or resources in confusing the data and not putting it in where it belongs. That's a safa. Not putting things where they belong is safa. You have the potential to probably do, an eloquent speaking. Are you using it for the right cause? You probably have a potential, got a lot of money. Are you putting it in where it belongs? If you're not putting it in where it belongs, then that's safa. If you probably are male or female, okay? Let's talk about female, since we are women, okay? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, for example, motherhood abilities, or given you those potentials, and you're basically confusing what you should be doing, and you're not putting it in the right place, basically a feminist influence telling you that marriage is caging you and all of that, then in that situation, that's safa. So whether we're speaking about social, biological, financial, or even different potentials that you could probably have, other people might not have, putting it in where it doesn't belong is safa. And that's why even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described Lut as being sufahat. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them the potential. What is potential? We're talking about reproduction. And they were basically putting it in the wrong place. What does that mean? Well, they were basically being gay. They were being gay and basically putting that type of potential energy, they were putting it in the wrong place. And instead of basically mating with females, they were basically wanting to mate with males. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it as safa. They were not putting that energy in the right place. They were confusing the energy. They were putting it in where it does not belong. So what does that mean? And that's the same thing. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the ability to, for example, get married, become a mother, etc., and you not using that, and considering that, no, I don't want to be a mother and all of that, and probably using the feminist narrative, and that, no, I'm going to adopt children. I want to adopt children. Okay, adopting is good, at least if you're, using the word adopt basically for legal terms. Okay, but you are being a guardian for children, fair enough. That's good. I'm not saying it's not good. But to say that I don't want to get children because there are enough children in the world, let's just adopt these, and that's safa. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the potential to become a mother. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you that, and to not use it in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you that potential to use it for, that's safa. That's safa. A safa is also confusing the interpretation. So a safa can confuse the resources. A safa can be confusing the data. A safa can be confusing the interpretation. Keep that one in mind. السفه can mean three things. سفها بغير علم. At the end, the ayah was saying it was سفها بغير علم, with no knowledge. What is with no knowledge? When you say no knowledge, this is talking about, well, they didn't even have the resource. They didn't even have the divine approval of all of this, but they were just making it up. What is it? حرموا ما رزقهم الله. They had restricted, or at least they had prevented what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them? Well, these children. So what did they do? They either buried the girls alive, or they buried or even killed the boys in service to the gods. And by the way, human sacrifice is something that was practiced in various religions. So even when we look at ancient Egypt, they would take a beautiful girl and throw her in the Nile River because they thought that that was going to bring good luck. We would say that in the ancient Egyptian, basically, archaeology to tell us that this was a practice that they would do. And human sacrifice for the gods, it was definitely a practice that we know in different religions. Okay, but at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, حَرَّمُوا مَا رَزَقَهُمُ اللَّهُ افْتِرَاءً عَلَى اللَّهِ. So even for the girls that would say, oh, I don't want to get children of my own, and I want to just adopt, حَرَّمُوا مَا رَزَقَهُمُ اللَّهُ افْتِرَاءً عَلَى اللَّهِ. Why are you saying iftira'an ala Allah, that this was going to be a better act, that this was going to be more noble, instead of bringing more children into this world that is an evil world? What are you doing? You're creating your own narrative. You're creating your own narrative. You're creating your own definition, and that you're basically considering it, oh, this is noble. So, but she's not saying that that's what God would say at the end. By considering it as a better act, as a more noble act, as a choice that is of a higher level of at least priority, etc. That's iftira'an ala Allah, because legislation is only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just keep that one in mind. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. Even if you might think of it, oh, I'm just here, just wanting, I don't mean to say that this is what the religion says. Yes, but you're still going back to the same description. سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ. Even if you don't say that that's what the religion says. Confusing and making up an interpretation that, oh, it's just better for the world, or it's just a way that I don't want to bring people into this evil world. I want to be kind. I want to be this. Well, at the end of the day, you are putting yourself into a position where you are prioritizing based on your own terms. Based on your own terms, and not based on the terms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you to basically live based on. What did the Prophet ﷺ say? Well, the Prophet ﷺ basically said, تَكَاثَرُوا فَإِنِّي مُبَاهٍ بِكُمُ الْأُمَمَ. The Prophet ﷺ said, I want you to get kids. I want you to have kids. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had told us that in the hadith, إذا مات ابن آدم, or the Prophet ﷺ told us in the hadith, إذا مات ابن آدم قطع عمله إلا من ثلاث. If the son of Adam dies, all the actions that they had done would basically be terminated, except from three things. And one of them was وَلَدٌ صَالِحٌ يَدْعُو لَهُ, a pious child that would make the dua for them. The benefit of getting children. So at the end, what am I doing? I'm here looking at the whole idea that when we want to do, whether understanding the resource, or whether reading the data, or whether making an interpretation, that could all be safa. What if we're talking about the practice? That could also be safa. Is safa is when a person goes against the priority or against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. Just give me a second. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I'm just, the technician and okay. قد خسر الذين قتلوا أولادهم سفها بغير علم وحرموا ما رزقهم الله افتراء على الله قد ضلوا. Now when you look at قد ضلوا right there, hold on, where is it? قد ضلوا at the end. What is قد ضلوا? You know what? Let's look at this description. Oh dear. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's look into these words right there. If you were to look at قد خسر الذين قتلوا سفها بغير علم. So the first description is that it was سفه. And then the second one is افتراء. The third one is ضلوا. And وما كانوا مهتدين. I want you to look at this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described it as number one, سفه, meaning that what we described earlier, that it basically is one, wrong resource, wrong data, confusing the interpretation, and basically getting into the wrong consequence. And iftira'an ala Allah. The other piece of it is حرموا ما رزقهم الله افتراء على الله. افتراء على Allah is telling you that in terms of resource, they attributed it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when the truth of the matter, it doesn't actually trace back all the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قد ضلوا in terms of what? In terms of practice. الضلال is to go off in a delusion. So now we're looking at safa is the big cup in terms of resource, but then it also would go and tell us, well, in terms of resource, that was a blasphemy attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَدْ ضَلُّوا in terms of reading the data, they confuse the data, and وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ in terms of interpretation and practice. Let's do it again. So we got safa, the whole action. Al-iftira is in resource. They attribute it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when in reality it wasn't to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-dalal in delusion is in reading the data. وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ they were not guided in terms of interpretation and in terms of application in practice. Remember when we have four things. Remember how we did it. We said resource, we said data, we said interpretation, and we said application. This is always, in all of the previous classes, we did it this way. We said resource is basically what resource defines right, wrong, what resource do we depend on. Then number two, we said the data, how we read the data that basically surrounds us, whether we're talking about social, religious, whatever it is. And then number three, how we interpret the data. And then number four, how we practice it and put it into application. All right, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that at the end, they basically had committed these types of actions in burying their children alive, in killing basically their sons or daughters, and that it was done under the pretense that it was for a religious reason, for a noble reason. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, this is for us to see the paradigms and for us to read how such confusions will eventually lead to misguidance in this dunya and misguidance in the akhirah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us learn how to see the paradigms. If you are confused about sometimes the resource, you're not sure which resource to do, you're going to get to the application. Look at the application. Look at where this is going. Look at where this is heading. Do you see the injustice that it brought? Yes. So if you were capable of seeing the injustice that it brought, that means the interpretation, the data, and the resource was all wrong. So sometimes we're capable of recognizing the resource by looking at the consequence. And sometimes we can read the resource, the consequence by looking at the resource. So two different ways. Okay, two different ways. Just keep that one in mind. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is helping them see that the resource that they were using, which is, but whether it's the culture or whether it's these people in service of the gods, or whether it was their own mind or their own speculation, that resource was wrong by looking at what did it lead to? Did it lead to justice? Did it lead to keeping and preserving your resources? Resources in terms of rizq, in terms of your social justice, in terms of, those are all things. Did it preserve that? No, it didn't. If it did not preserve your resources, and if it did not bring social justice, and if it did not bring in basically the benefit, then there's something wrong with the basis that you are basically using as the key to see and use as the key to define things for you. Then there's something wrong with the source itself. So that's basically what the Quran is letting us know. Quran is teaching us there are different ways to debate them. Sometimes you need to look at the end and the consequence, and sometimes you need to discuss the resource and say, well, how does this go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Where did you get it from? Do you have any evidence? Is there a prophet? Is there a resource? Are your resources, is your Bible, is it basically going back to evidences that makes it not contradicting another manuscript? Is it not contradicting itself? Is it containing words or evidences that it's not contradicting whether itself or contradicting what we know is fact? So in that situation, you would either study the resource itself, or you would study the consequence and what this led to in order to recognize that the resource was basically not credible. Okay, so that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them see. They were not guided, they confused everything, they basically went into a delusion, and therefore the resource was all basically a delusion. They attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the truth of the matter, it is not based on Allah, it was based on their own selves. It was based on giving and making things up and attributing it that it was divine based, when in reality it was all human based, that it was based on whether misogyny or whether feminist, because even feminist is going to be another form of jahiliyyah, or whether it was certain biases or personal interest or whatever it is. At the end, it basically led to a confusion in reading the resources, reaching to understanding the data, and making false interpretations. And finally, the consequence was nothing but injustice. Okay, let's see. Al-Qurtubi says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is informing us about the infanticide that they were committing. And certainly all the different rituals that they considered that certain animals were only to be used for religious reasons, or they might actually cut their ears in certain ways to identify which one was used, which one was used for religious or which one was used for a particular god or whatever it is. So they created their own rituals. Okay, at the end, of course, they were also killing their children in fear of poverty. Okay, hold on. They were killing their own children in fear of poverty. Are you talking about literally killing, or are you talking about that they were basically avoiding children, or what does it actually mean? Are they selling it? Remember, they used to consider their children as their own property, as personal property. Islam tells us, well, no, your children are not your property, but they are attributed to you, and you have the responsibility. That's why he called them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that they are your children. Why? Because in a way that it is your responsibility, it is within your jurisdiction to discipline them, to give them basically the different resources, etc. That's within your responsibility. But that does not mean that you would determine everything about their life. Your duty as a parent is to mentor them to get to Jannah, to guide them towards Jannah. But at the end of the day, is that we don't have the power to bring guidance, but we have the responsibility to give them at least the ability to find guidance. At the end of the day, إنك لا تهدي من أحببت ولكن الله يهدي من يشاء. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives guidance. I can train you, I can discipline you, I can teach you, I can do all the necessary things to help you find hidayah. But if you don't want to choose hidayah, I can only direct you to it. That's it. All right, so let's see what he said. قلت إنه كان من العرب ما يقتل ولده خشية الإملاق. That is al-Qurtubi, because some scholars had actually said that no, it's not that they were in fear of poverty that they killed their children, but they were basically in fear, of course, of the girls that they certainly feared. And it wasn't all tribes, by the way. Not all tribes did the practice of infanticide. Not all tribes. It was only certain tribes. So let's see. And he said, وَكَانَ مِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقْتُلُهُ سَفَهًا بِغَيْرِ حُجَّةٍ مِنْهُمْ فِي قَتْلِهِمْ. So some tribes, they would kill the children because they would basically consider that they would consider them as an obstacle in their life, or probably going to be eating up their resources. Some tribes, and those were Rabi'a and Mudar. And some of them would kill the girls because they considered that they would bring in a chance of ruining their reputation, ruining their family's reputation. And some would say that the girls were the daughters of God. Let me tell you this story. Ruwiya, what do we mean by ruwiya? That is an indication that it does not have a strong chain of narration, meaning that it was mentioned, but not necessarily with credible chains of narration. Let's look at this story. A man from the Prophet's companions, he would always be sitting مغتماً بين يدي الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. in complete distress in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So one day, the Prophet ﷺ tells him, why are you in complete distress? And he said, O Prophet of Allah, I had committed a sin during the time of Jahiliyyah, in the pre-prophetic era. And I fear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not forgive me if I had become Muslim. And the Prophet ﷺ said, tell me about your sin. And he said, O Prophet of Allah, I was one of those that were killing their daughters. So I had a daughter born to me. And her mother had interceded that I would not leave her. And I had left her when she had grown older. And once she is capable of understanding, in other words, she was around 9 years old or something, and she was one of the most beautiful women. People were coming to ask for her hand in marriage. But I basically had the feeling of al-hamiyya. Al-hamiyya is basically that jahiliyyah, that didn't want their daughter going anywhere. So he said, and I was not capable of having my heart get her married and get her out of the house without marriage. So he was afraid that that girl was going to probably be a promiscuous girl in any way. So he said, I told my wife, I want to take my daughter to such and such tribe, as a visit, to visit some of my relatives. So send her with me. She was so happy about it. She beautified her and gave her the best beautification, breast jewelry. And then she took a promise on me that I would not betray that girl. And he said, I took her to an abandoned well, and I looked at the well, and but the girl, she basically recognized that her father was up to something. And she recognized that I was about to throw her in the well. So she holds my hands and she started crying. And she said, oh, Father, what do you want to do with me? What are you going to do with me? So at one point, I was feeling merciful. Then I looked at the abandoned well, and then I remembered that hamiyya, that jahiliyyah in me. And then my daughter held on to me and she said, Dad, Father, don't let go of the promise that you had promised my mother. And he looked at the well, and then once again looked at the well, looked at her, was getting a glance at the girl, a glance at the well. And then he said, the shaitan had overcome me. And I took her and basically threw her in the well. And she was calling me, Daddy, Daddy, you had just killed me. And then he stayed there as he heard her voice, and then the voice eventually was gone. The voice died out, and he went back, and the Prophet ﷺ started crying, and his companions started crying. And the Prophet ﷺ commented, and he said, if I were ordered to punish anybody for what they had done during Jahiliyyah, I would have punished you. Now, here are a couple of things about the story. The story is definitely so emotional. A couple of things to say. Number one is that, was that a practice that they used to do? Well, there's no question that this was a practice that was common and that they used to do it. Okay. Now, is the story containing at least validity? In other words, is the story authentic? So according to the resource, is that it was narrated duna isnad. It did not have a chain of narration. So we are not capable of verifying whether this is an authentic story or not, but we are capable of at least knowing that such stories existed. So this becomes more of a historical artifact, if you may, but not necessarily something that we could verify as in terms of chain of narration, as in terms of hadith and so forth. All right. So now we would just see how the resources that they had was taking them away of their fitrah, taking them away from their fitrah. And we're going to be just ending today up to here. And inshallah, hopefully tomorrow, we'll talk about وهو الذي أنشأ جنات معروشات وغير معروشات والنخل والزرع مختلفا أكله والزيتون والرمان. Inshallah, we'll continue that next week. But guess what? This ayah has 23 different matters to talk about. So, in other words, we're really going to be spending a lot of time just on this ayah, but inshallah, we will be getting a lot of, and especially just this word right here, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. So if there are any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. And if there are any questions or if there are any comments, I'd be happy to listen.